Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us once again. This is an Apprenticeship Insights podcast, and joining myself, Vinh, who is the host today, is our two returning experts within the apprenticeship sector. And first of all, joining us once again is Bally, Bhogal of the Alex Group, and Natalie Ray of Natalie Ray Consultancy. Bally, first of all, thank you for joining me again. How are you? How are things?
Yeah, not bad, Vin. Thank you again for hosting us. Really excited to be talking about this particular subject today about systems management, information systems with Natalie again. Thank you.
And Natalie, great to hear from you again as always. How are things?
Good, thank you. Again, an absolute pleasure to be here working with you both on this and keen to get this conversation discussed today and out to our clients and our network, because it's a really important conversation to be had.
Great, thank you. And I do concur, this is extremely important to all apprenticeship training providers and beyond. And the topic today is review of the systems that are being used by apprenticeship training providers, management information systems which do drive apprenticeship delivery, of which there are plenty. And it can be quite overwhelming to all involved, but we're going to break it down here in this podcast today. Discuss what are the issues, what the resolutions to those issues are, and why they're so important. So let's go straight to it. Natalie, if you could help us break down what the systems are being used to deliver apprenticeships and why are those systems being used?
Thank you very much, Vin. I would love to be able to start this off and give you a really comprehensive, simple and succinct list, but it's not really typical of apprenticeship provision, as we know. So the systems being used, if we first look at the internal lens, and then we'll hand over to Bally shortly, who'll look slightly wider at sort of those driven by the ESFA. But internally, these are going to be individual to each provider in the organisation, and it will depend on the portfolio of courses or educational offer that they support. It will be aligned or driven by their apprenticeship or student numbers, and also their internal specific ways of working and operational practices. So the first recommendation that we bring is that providers look at the systems being used in their entirety and carry out a systems review, which is sort of what we're focusing in on today's discussion. But just to name a few so that we can really get the conversation going that may resonate with our listeners here is that they typically include a learning management system. A lot of providers would use an e-portfolio system for sort of the on-programme mapping and progression and contact time with their apprentices. The business entities or employer entities within the organisations may use a CRM system. Then we've got any relevant EPAO or awarding body portals for any mandatory qualifications or complementary qualifications, and then that endpoint assessment part, fundamental part of the apprenticeship journey. There'll be manual, I'm sure, trackers and spreadsheets in every single provider to map progress in either processes or learner or employer progress or details. And we see a lot of trackers happening already still in today's world of apprenticeship provision, where there isn't the joined up linkage that we need between different or multiple systems. So they'll all have their own internal tracking for that part of process management or provision management that doesn't really exist within the platforms. There'll also be quality of education or quality or assurance systems that providers might be engaged with, or they might have their internal tracking of that. There's of course going to be their management information systems or their ILR platforms to be able to produce the ILR for each returns. To bring into the conversation, we might have functional skills initial assessment platforms or functional skills delivery support platforms, online learning packages as well to support the delivery. And then some providers as well will either have an internal process or might engage with an external package to support that additional learning needs assessment that's required. Again, just want to mention as well around the personal development and tutorial aspect of apprenticeships, there may also be another internal programme or an external programme that supports that. The list goes on, as you can see, as we start to build quite a complex and what can be an overwhelming picture, but hopefully that sort of starts to set the scene there for you, Vin.
It most certainly does. I heard a lot of acronyms there, which is hopefully something which is very familiar to all those within the apprenticeship field, but as you say, is very complicated. But Bally, anything to add to that?
Yeah, for sure, Vin. Thanks, Natalie. It's making my eyes swivel sat here, and you kind of reminded really of how complex apprenticeship delivery really is. And actually, when you add if you like, the sort of external systems, the ESFA, the government-led portals that are absolutely necessary to deliver apprenticeships. It complicates the whole systems conversation even further. So then you have this set of systems by the ESFA. You have the IDAM system, that stands for Identity and Access Management System. Frankly, without that, you can't even be an apprenticeship training provider. You have what used to be called like the ESFA Hub is now called Submit Learner Data. So it's nice and easy to remember, but what that allows you to do is actually submit your learner information to the agency, to the government, so they're well aware of how many learners you've got, what programs they're on, where they're at. It also helps them with compliance and funding, policy. They use all of that information to help drive policy in the future, and also to manage funding, claims, etc. And that system also allows the FE sector to post sort of staff vacancy data and also governance data as well. That particular system also allows employers to be given identifier numbers. So if there is an apprentice at a particular site in the country, in England, then you're having unique identifier for that postcode, for that particular location. That's where that apprentice is working and operating as an apprentice. That's where the delivery is being given. So you need a unique number for that. That number is actually generated by the Employer Data Service, which is now also part of Submit Learner Data Service. You've also got the SFS, which is a skills funding service. So that allows providers to manage all their contracts, manage their funding allocations, sign documents, view their allocations, and also manage their subcontractors. Kind of either let the agency know that they've had an additional subcontractor or they've lost 2 or 3 subcontractors, let them go, for example. If you really get and dig deep into some of the delivery, there's FIS, Funding Information System. I see that as a bit of a sieve. So you can put all of your learner data in it and out pops the clean data. What you're left behind with is the errors that you want to correct before you submit all of your data to the agency. So that's FIS. There's also PDSATs, a tool that allows you to generate samples if you want to do your own audits, but equally gives you reports. It kind of gives you a bit of line of inquiry as to where there might be information issues with regards to your management information, specifically aligned to learner data. And then there's the Learner Record Service, the LRS, I think it's changed to PLR now. And that allows you to check to see if a learner has any particular certificates already, qualifications, what their previous educational history has been from school onwards. So you can, if you like, you can kind of do all of that, check the checks and balances before they actually go on to program. And then there's the apprenticeship service as well. Natalie and I are aware of, it used to be called the digital apprenticeship service. That's what providers use and employers to manage their apprentices, that they're actually on program or they're coming off program or they're on a withdrawal. Also, you can use that as a stop-start system, adding, completing, taking away. That's the kind of your front main interface. And the list goes on. I think I must have counted from Natalie about 10 or 12. And here I've got at least another 6 or 7 to add. So shall we just round it up to about 20? Is that fair, Natalie? I don't know what you think, but that's kind of sort of my addition to where we're at on systems, the whole sort of kit and caboodle that's required to deliver apprenticeships.
Yeah, most definitely. I think it certainly starts to paint a picture, which is the purpose of it, isn't it? I think we could go on, we could explore it. Is, as I said before, going to be quite individual to that organisation, but we do start to paint that picture of just how complex and layered it can be. And here we want to talk about what the challenge of that might be, and also some strategies to improve that.
20 is a lot. Coming from someone who, isn't an apprenticeship training provider or doesn't work to the capacity that you both do as experts, 20 seems like a huge number of different systems to have to rely on and use. And it does immediately highlight logically one issue, and is that how do you centralize all of these different systems that are being required to use? Is there a way that you can unify this across the entire sector or not? Is what I'm wondering initially. And that actually leads into my second question, which we've kind of covered already, but which systems are driven and powered by the ESFA in particular, Bally?
So the ones that I just listed to you, Vinh, are the ones that are generally powered by the ESFA. They're the ones that the providers generally don't tend to know about, especially if they're brand new. But equally, if individuals have been working in apprenticeship training providers, it's not necessarily the case that they will also know about the ESFA systems. they generally tend to know about their own systems, although Natalie and I have also had conversations about sometimes when they don't. So there's all sorts of issues and challenges that all of these systems present. And I think actually, I don't know, Natalie, if you want to kind of come in there on the issues and challenges, it's probably a really good place to start.
Absolutely. I think what we can see, without really having to sort of labour the point, where we have a layered up process of multiple systems that do, or in some cases don't work together, more often than not, without having to spend too much time unpicking it, that lends itself to lead organisations with a lack of connectivity around the management and performance information that's required to run provision. It's not to say that people aren't capable of doing it or aren't doing a good job with the complexities of the structure and the systems that are in place, but it does, as you rightly picked up on there, Vin, it does lend itself to be very typical of not then having a singular central source of the data and information. So that might mean that even just at sort of management sort of tier, that there's multiple platforms and systems that lend ourselves to the information and data that we need at that level and that type of conversation, but again coming from various different sources. And then if you bring in all of the operational platforms and systems that we mentioned earlier on, and then our internal tracking, we can quite quickly see that there's going to be minimal connectivity between those, and then that stops the timely flow of information through the organisations that it's required so that we can make business and operational decisions on the most up-to-date data of our performance across, financial, learner progression, funding forecasts, predictions for achievement, all of those on programme and business provision management requirements. Where we have lack of connectivity between systems and multiple systems, it allows or it opens us up to an awful amount of having to duplicate information. And that means that someone somewhere has probably got to, if they really unpicked it through a systems review, realise that some user entry or information entry probably has to be populated multiple times on various different platforms. So that does lend itself for organisational practice or operational practice to be quite high and unproductive in the sort of levels and requirements of manual administrative tasks. I'm sure Bally can come in, but probably would be nodding and agreeing with me that sometimes when we work with our clients, and we certainly speak with operational teams about how they have, they're quite admin heavy with some of the work that they have to do. And I've had conversations with people before where they want to be really on the road, or they want to be really in front of employers and apprentices to do the job, but there's that sort of layered task of all that administrative reporting. Now, where we have these multiple systems, that lends itself to the continuation of that, and then we have to ask, not only does it increase the required levels of manual input, opens us up for duplication, it then leads ourselves to not really have confidence in our data or lack of data integrity across the provision. And then, it goes back to that operational conversation of, could that time, that administrative data input, data scrutiny time be better used to drive performance and provide apprenticeship programmes in the way that we want to? So where there's multiple sources of data, we'll have inconsistency of the use and also the interpretation of that performance and provision monitoring. And multiple teams or multiple roles within the provision would need to spend, and still do need to spend, far too much time cleansing data, scrutinising that data, and probably manipulating reports so they reflect what they believe to be accurate, because we haven't got the strength in the flow of that information going through the organisation to the required levels.
Fantastic, Natalie. Thank you so much. Bally, anything else to add to that? Any other issues or challenges that you can think of?
Yeah, I think it reminds me of my time of working in a very large apprenticeship training provider. We had some 4,000, 5,000 apprentices, and it can become really overwhelming and disheartening for colleagues that are working in finance, that are working in funding compliance, that are working in contracts, that are working, when you look at all the hard set of data, funding rules, etc., and it can become really disheartening that you cannot put your hand on one source where you think, yeah, this is the absolute, oracle, this is where all the data is absolutely clean, it's up to date, it's fully reliable. And I think that's the hard bit, that people work so hard in apprenticeship training providers, and there's no real one place that you can put your hand on to think, yeah, this is reflective of us, this is exactly where we're at, and it's good. Everything's on green, the dashboards are green, we're flying high, etc. And I think without that, it's everything that Natalie's described, in as much as you're running around like headless chickens trying to find the information, manipulating, spending time. There's a lot of time wastage, frankly, duplication, money's wasted, time is wasted, effort's wasted, and it disheartens, people as well. And I find that starts to then sort of have other effects in terms of, you look at them finances, for example. I mean, I remember when working in a provider, when you'd have to question whether or not the finance reports were up to date as well, because just trying to find a system that aligns with the way that payments are made, that you can use for forecasting. I've had some meetings with clients of late where their colleagues have spent about 2 weeks putting together a spreadsheet that kind of almost mimics the way that payments are made by the government around apprenticeships. So they've put in all the algorithms, their best sort of stab at this, just to be able to try to simulate where they might be. And really, that's where we're at the minute, because there's so much overwhelm with these systems, and it can be disheartening for colleagues. But equally, as Natalie's already mentioned, it can take a lot more time out of people's diary, and frankly, you have to have a big heart to want to put your efforts into something like that, and have very broad shoulders to be the person that sort of stands up to say, okay, you know what, I'll take this on, I'll do the systems review, and I'll let you know. Somebody needs to be very, very detailed in their approach, very, very knowledgeable about the whole infrastructure and how it works, both internally and externally, to be able to do that review.
Sounds like quite disruptive behavior, Bally, if you don't mind me saying so. I love to use that word. But thank you both for highlighting issues that providers have to deal with. So, of course, the next question would be, how can these issues be resolved? We know what the issues are, been made clear. What is the obvious solutions to these issues, Natalie, would you say?
Again, it's going to be very specific to the organisation. I completely agree with what Bally's just sort of shared and expressed there around it really needing to have an ownership. And I think sometimes that's something we miss when we've got these problems with data, is people really owning their data and performance, because there's a sort of reluctance to do that because they don't have confidence in that. And then you think about that from sort of a leadership and management point of view, it doesn't sort of share confidence and accuracy through the organisation as well. So it's incredibly pertinent to have this conversation. And there are ways in which this can be established and can be developed. Again, it would be typical and individual to an organisation, because each infrastructure, each institution will have its own structure and systems in this way. So it would need to have external or internal advice and ownership in taking the direction forward. But it would need to obviously have work closely with operational teams to build that picture. But there are opportunities to look at the systems and talk about data integration, and to talk with your system providers and say, well, actually, we work with this system and this system. Is there opportunity to have a relationship? Does the data bridging between this system and this system, or our ILR system and our learner management system, is there connectivity, and does it flow both ways? So we need to establish that connectivity where possible between systems. There are tools like Power BI or dashboards or equivalent sort of platforms that can be used to develop and support central tracking and performance visibility, taking data and information and fields from various different sources and producing it into a really what can be quite a really beautiful visual display of performance. And again, that can be tailored and bespoke to the individual needs. In the work that I've done in a sort of advising and supporting clients with sort of building some more monitoring tools, etc., to centralize that data, each one's very different, because one, you're going to have different platforms to use, but equally you're going to have different internal KPIs or expectations or internal intervention areas that you might want to build into that. But it actually becomes a really tailored, beautiful central platform in which you can start to get the whole audience of the organisation using the one singular data force. So there are opportunities out there. To start by that, I think it's really important to conduct what we're calling, or I call, a systems review, and that's to really map out and build a process and systems matrix for your organisation. And by doing that, it can help to identify improved ways of working, streamlining of processes, and looking at opportunities to reduce duplication of information, and then maximise and work towards sort of optimal efficiency around the business and ways of working as well.
Great, thank you, Natalie. Thank you so much. Bally, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I loved all of that, Natalie. I have to say, back in the day when all these Power BI systems and reports and all this kind of these funky words weren't around, we just used to use probably the best version I saw before the introduction of Power BI was this PowerPoint presentation version, and it was powered by loads of different data sources coming into that, and a provider had created it, and I was just like, wow, that looks amazing. So I think what you're describing in Power BI now, that we've come to learn, is now Power BI and lots of different platforms powering that information on one central source. They look great and they're really, really useful. Unfortunately, our sector, they're not prevalent in the sector. The sector's definitely starting to hear more about this and trying to create that. We're in that journey right now, but certainly we're not there in terms of, the gold standard. We'd like to talk about the gold standard later, and some do, but again, it's just starting to emerge. I think for me, going back to the question, there's definitely a question of ownership in terms of who sanctions that, these systems should be. There's obviously the ESFA systems, they're a given. You cannot deliver apprenticeships, correct me if I'm wrong, without those ESFA systems. Certain systems, if you like, by awarding bodies, and universities will say the same, that they have their own systems that they have to use. So those aside, I think there has to be then some kind of a central source or person in charge that says, okay, well, what systems have we got here? As you said about, with regards to this review, what have we already got in place? What more do we need? How does it work with what we've already got? And what value is it going to add? Where are we going to reduce duplication? All of this. So I think for me, it's about the ownership and accountability. So you do need somebody looking at this from a very high level with a view to knowing the impact it will have on the ground. But then equally, Nat's already talked quite a lot about data integration between those systems. I think for me, it's about how do staff typically get to know about systems that are being used by the business? Where is the training around that? We always have lots of training around statutory training, so like health and safety and all the rest of it. We'll have a safeguarding prevent training. We'll have training around our curriculum, how we deliver, all of our sort of systems around the learner focus systems, if you like. But how about the rest? Where is that sort of overview around these are all the systems that we use? This is everything it takes for us to deliver apprenticeships. See if we don't know about these, or if we don't give them the proper airtime, if we don't complete them on time, if we don't have a standard in place for ensuring proper use of them, timely use of them, then everything falls down, if you like. Or not everything, but maybe being a little bit dramatic there, but it all falls down. And then how do we as managers get the information that we need, and how do we know that it's accurate at the point at which we're reviewing it to make decisions going forward? So I think for me, I'm just going to take it out of the kind of harder aspects into those softer around people, accountability, and of training, and then around sort of staff appraisals, that where is it in the staff appraisals that you're equally accountable for ensuring that data and management information systems, whether they're ESFA powered or whether they're our own, are up to date.
Great, thank you, Bally. Thank you so much. Now, Natalie, you touched upon one of the solutions would be conducting a systems review. I was actually going to ask if this solution has been integrated before, and evidently it has, in the form of systems review. So I wanted to ask you to break down what a systems review typically involves. What are the aims of a systems review? And if you could elaborate further on that, please.
Thank you, of course. I think it's a systems review can be whatever you want to do. It is what it says on the tin. It's about reviewing your systems in place, but we're trying to champion here that it's a whole organisational approach and view to that. So my advice and guidance and some of the work that I do with people when we do this is the best way to do this, in my view, is to map out the apprenticeship journey. There are visuals and aids out there online or through some of your contacts that just kind of try and take a complex apprenticeship journey and simplify it into a visual. But identifying from start to finish all the sort of key components that make up an apprenticeship journey from start all the way through to apprenticeship completion and success. It's to use a visual aid like that or an apprenticeship journey and identify internally what tracking portals, programs or systems are your colleagues or the organisation using or having to access to be able to move through one of those components making up an apprenticeship journey. I think it's really important that it is inclusive of many different job roles when you conduct that review. I agree with Bally, it needs senior leadership or an overarching higher position to sort of own this and look at it organisational wide, but they shouldn't be doing those conversations in isolation. For instance, we don't know what we don't know, so and that's extremely applicable to this conversation. So I would really encourage people when they conduct a system review to take a representative from each of the teams that contribute and facilitate apprenticeship delivery and programmes from start to finish, so that they can really build that organisational picture. I've had a conversation several times with sort of managers when we unpick this, and they normally come to me and say, well, we've only got 4 or we've got 5 or 6. And it's never to overwhelm or stress or complicate the situation. But then when we start to unpick and unravel some of those other components that we talked about at the earlier part of this podcast about those different platforms that they might use, they start to quite quickly see that list begins to get longer. And as Bally has quite rightly supported this conversation with that kind of view from the external point of view, from the ESFA powered by the government, etc., it becomes a complex picture. So it's about really involving those people with the knowledge to represent their part of the programme and the organisation and coming together into some sort of working group. And I think once that matrix or that mapping process has been completed, it's about sort of then using the kind of zooming in and zooming out method to really unpick it further. So looking at it as entirety across the apprenticeship journey might become a slightly overwhelming picture, but then it's about zooming into each of those systems or those portals, all those components of that apprenticeship journey, and trying to identify opportunity for integration between systems, better ways of working, streamlining those processes, etc. Or where we might know that a system might integrate very well with another system, or in a longer term mapping exercise. And I would then say that once you've done that kind of zooming in and zooming out exercise, you conduct a roadmap that would have a short, medium and long term sort of alignment of those objectives to be able to really work towards business improvements. And I think that it's fundamental because we tend to layer up our activity when we've got areas for intervention or improvement or policy change. And what this activity is sort of encouraging people to do is to take a pause and a stop sometimes and realise how layered sometimes in and outside of our control the system has become. So being able to pause, look at it holistically, and then really create a structured roadmap through to improvements, we will then have a slightly easier action plan or a project plan to follow. And the reason why it's so critical is that we really should make sure that we're raising the profile in organisations to try and improve the functionality and capability of our systems, to improve the ways of working for our workforce and our operational teams, so that they can do, continue to do a wonderful job that we know that they do already, but in easier, more efficient ways.
I think that sums up. Thank you so much, Natalie. I think you've already touched upon what the benefits and the outcomes of a system review would be. But just to clarify, Bally, was there anything you wanted to add to that at all? What are the other outcomes and benefits of a systems review that you can think of?
I think, Natalie's just outlined it wonderfully well. I was just really kind of listening to her, and it just does make you think that it is hard. It's really tough when you are overwhelmed by so many systems, so many data capture forms and portals, etc. Every different sort of stakeholder, every stakeholder wants their own set of information. You seem to be spending 50 to 60% of your time filling out these systems. So not only, why doesn't it take just one system whereby you add a learner to the system, you do all of their initial assessment, skill scans, etc., basically looking at whether or not they're right for the program, add them to the program, get them through the program, support their their learning journey, basically, get towards the end, have all of their assets that they've created along their way, their work in that system. And why can't we get all the stakeholders to basically have a login at the right point to review what they need to review, rather than then have logins for providers to join new systems to then submit the information? Like, for me, and it's never going to happen, but for me, what would be ideal, that if there was one system that was really well created. I mean, we all know that apprenticeships is a government owned program. You can't just go off willy-nilly. This whole program, the term itself, is protected by law, is governed by law, it's in statute, it's legal. You have legal implications if you use this whole term outside of what it's intended for. It's a government program. Now, if the government gave that system and said, okay, and then all endpoint assessment organizations can only log in at this point of our system, it's just one system, it would make it so much easier. That is never going to happen. That's probably for another lifetime. But here we are with all these various systems. So the benefits and outcomes, really, you have to do a systems review with a view to getting to the point where, having done the review and having created this structured plan, as Natalie's described, is you get to an end point. The end goal has to be that it makes your life easier, that you are only then using the systems and the processes that contribute towards efficiency, that streamline processes, that don't waste time, don't waste effort, don't waste energy, that effectively get to the end point sooner. And like you say, you've maximized the time with the learner and with the learning process and with supporting learners, rather than spending all this time on administration around systems. And that's ultimately what the outcome and the benefit of a systems review has to be. And equally, today, I mean, for example, in the news, I read that one provider has been awarded an Ofsted outstanding, but because of all the admin around apprenticeships, and I'm pretty certain, even though it doesn't say this specifically around systems, they're going to be leaving the marketplace after being awarded an Ofsted outstanding because of all of the admin that goes with it, the complexities of running apprenticeships. And we have to get to the point where our staff are happy with the systems that are being utilised. They understand why they're being utilised. They understand the objectives. They are using almost like the fewest systems as possible, in my opinion, personal opinion that is, that it requires to actually power the apprenticeship and deliver it to its maximum potential, and that minimal amount of resources and finance and effort and energy are being utilised. We've got to get to that place, and I don't think we're there. I don't think we're there at all.
That's interesting, and particularly about the provider which is leaving the marketplace. Surprising news, but let's see what we can discuss about that and possibly in another podcast. But my next question would be, what should providers be aiming for when it comes to leveraging these systems to deliver these apprenticeships? Let's put it another way. What is the gold standard that needs to be achieved here? And this is a question for both. What do we need to do? How do we need to do this? We pretty much discussed this already, but what needs to be done? What should providers be aiming for to achieve that standard? Bally, I wanted to get your answer first, if that's okay.
In one respect, you have to accept that there's all these systems that you have to use. But in my experience, I think it's been accepted. And it's a bit like 1 potato, 2 potato, 3 potato, 4, that, you know, the systems simply just keep getting added to the others. So we just keep the number of systems keep increasing. And I don't think, unless Natalie, feel free as well to correct me, that I've seen particularly where anybody sort of stopped to say, why are we getting another system in? Why aren't we using what we already have? So I think the gold standard has to be utilising the absolute minimal amount of systems that it takes to deliver apprenticeships well, and to deliver them without duplication, without all of that effort that we've already mentioned. Equally, what you want is that single source, if you like, even if it is different systems powering one central dashboard, You want that single source, which gives you the confidence that, yeah, we've got all the data here on one at a click of a button. It's powered by the systems that we're happy to use that help us with our performance management, help us understand where we are in real time. We can kind of almost understand where the issues are. We can understand where we want to improve, so we can add it to a structured improvement plan, all of that. It gives you data that you're confident to work with as well. I personally would like roles and responsibilities brought into it as well. So what is the standard? You know, what are the expectations? So when people join your organization, to what extent are they trained? What extent are they informed about the various systems? Okay, the ones that are given, that we can't do anything about, but then equally the ones that we utilize, that we have full control over. We have bought these as apprenticeship training providers to make our lives easier for our colleagues, for our governors, for our managers. And actually, when you think about governors and managers, you know, they need reports as well that are operational in nature, but equally headlines. The gold standard is also being a governor and looking at that information, knowing full well it's reliable, it's accurate, it can be utilized, and the integrity is high in as much as making those decisions, well-informed decisions for the provider going forward, that you're not second guessing all the time, you're not always looking over your shoulder, it's not behind in terms, there's no lag. Currently, as it stands, you're not always going to get that from the ESFA systems. Like, there'll always be some lag because it generates information and reports based on the ILR information that's been sent in, being submitted. So there's always going to be some lag. The onus is then down to the provider to ensure that they have the information that is up to date. Yeah, I don't think you can sit around and do nothing as a provider. Like, if you're wholly reliant on the ESFA systems, then you might run into difficulty. You might not if you're small, and as we've said, it's all down to scale, size, number of programs, complexity, and you might be absolutely fine. But then this whole need to have spreadsheets and RAG rated reports and all of this to hold it all together, I don't think we'll ever get away from that. But what we do want is visibility across all the data, whatever systems that we're using, ideally minimal amount, to be able to get the information that we need and to have faith in that information. And the other probably last thing that I'd want to mention is the kind of different formats that you can get that information in. So where I used to work, we had a great designer, basically. Our business plans, we had a full document for that, but equally we had like an executive summary. And I felt we were quite ahead of the curve at the time, back in 2014-15. If our designer is listening to this podcast, you are absolutely amazing, and you still are, I know it. But he used to do like infographics for us, different sorts of tables. We had like little test tubes bubbling away. We had little icons that kind of gave plenty of white space, lots of sort of percentages, pie charts, if you like, little visuals with lots of white space, whereby with indicators, with almost traffic lighted as well, in a way whereby you could tell at a glance that, yeah, we're all right on this KPI because it's there in an infographic format. But if I wanted to read about why is that red, I could read that. I could read in the main document. I think there's too much still. We're very text based, very text heavy. Ideally, I would like it in terms of gold standard to become a little less text heavy. I don't think we'll ever get away from that, but people are very time poor in our sector. I would like it to become a little bit more where it is, so they can look at it like almost at a glance. They can look at trends, charts, tables, proportions, insights, infographics, use of icons. And I've been presenting some of this in some of the training that I've been doing online as part of the AWD program as well, which has gone down really well. And that section, if you like, it's been a bit of an eye-opener and is very, very relative to what we're talking about today: systems, management, information, and presenting data in different ways, so that you minimize the amount of time that you've got to discuss things, because actually the information is available to you at a glance. Sorry, that was a really long answer to a very short question. I hope that helps.
It definitely helps, and definitely didn't feel like a long answer, because the more comprehensive the answer, the better. I think this information is extremely important. I did also latch onto one of the points that you made in this sector. It is very time poor. So people just never have enough time to do everything that they need to do. I want to touch upon a point that Natalie that you made as part of what they're supposed to do when it comes to managing these systems, is that the duplication of data can take up so much time. So it does all tie in together. Having said that, Natalie, is there anything else you wanted to mention that would maintain this standard which all providers should be aiming for?
Absolutely. I think it's a nice segue into my first point, really, about staffing and resources, and we've touched on it, but just to really bring the point home and extend the point that Bally made there, is I would ask managers influence of making sort of progress or conducting these review, anyone in that kind of position of influence or control or leadership, how often, and I'm sure on a daily basis, how often do you have conversations around staffing where they don't have the capacity or the time to fulfill something, or they have a really innovative, strong idea, but there isn't enough resource, or that there's quite a long-standing staff absence in a certain part of the organisation that they can't recruit for, or there's a high turnover of staff in a particular entity. All of this staffing, which is your best, obviously the strongest asset within the organisation, all of these staffing and resource issues could be really supported by putting some attention and some investment into this conversation and reviewing it within organisations. So I can't champion and support that enough about the direct and longer term impact, satisfaction of your employees, but also the business outputs and performance contribution that this kind of conversation and this kind of activity would work. But just to extend the conversation around gold standard, rather than being really specific in detailing what that looks like, I'd just like to offer some considerations that I would recommend people consider. It's about asking yourselves, how could you centralise your data for the organisation? What things could you put in place, or what conversations could you have to try and move towards one single data source? And then how can that be presented in that organisation so there is transparency through the organisation against performance, and that the view of systems is produced to different audience types? And Bally touched on there about being able to present that in different formats applicable and appropriate to the different audiences within the organisation that we need to report. But we need to make sure that those reports, those audience types, are all being fed information that's timely and coming from a single central data source. So it's about reviewing that question when you go through a systems review and undertake any project work to sort of prove that. I think another gold standard question would be, who in your organisation has leadership and ownership of systems, programs and portals? Is there an identified personnel in a leadership position, really, sort of certainly at a senior business level position, business management positions, who has complete ownership of the whole organisational picture? Because too often we hear conversations, or I have conversations with organisations and institutions within this sector, where a manager of a certain function's gone out and engaged with a platform, but a manager in another function's gone out and engaged with another platform that could have the capability to have extended the work expectation that the second platform or the first one that I mentioned was being required. And I think there isn't this joined up collaborative picture of systems and portals. So too much work is happening in isolation. Too many decisions are being made. Now, it's not about authorising that process and taking that kind of ownership or flow or direction away from managers, but certainly in those larger functions, is there a working group that has these conversations on a regular basis so that we can make sure that we are conducting those conversations and having those conversations about streamlining that activity and really bringing those isolated conversations and decision making back into sort of a whole organisational approach? It's about who owns that, who oversees that, who's got a view of all of those things happening moving forward. I'd also consider the question about, how do you support within your organisation strengthening and producing a comprehensive and robust reporting structure? So that's where we're relying on meeting structures, the conversations, our caseload reviews, all in line to have that operational up-to-date information ready to submit to our IRR returns, for example. So we're making sure that actually, as we go into the planning for a next contract year or an academic year, could we review the structure and the ways of working to make sure that that's all a fit for purpose as well, so we can have that flow through there. And then just finally, with a lot of talk at the moment about the advancements of AI, and I know this conversation's incredibly pertinent, there's a lot in the news at the moment, but these conversations have been happening for quite some time now. And then the pace of digital advancements and transformation over recent years and what the projections would be. We have an obligation to maintain, as educational providers, but also as business functions, to maintain alignment and staying in line with how that moves forward. And therefore, this conversation really does need to be had. And then finally, something that we don't see enough as a standard is where this conversation and this work is part of your self-assessment report and your quality or continuous improvement plan within the organisation. So there is something about functionality, working practices in every year. Where are we? What are our strengths and weaknesses? What are our opportunities? And then what are we going to action plan and try and really deliver progress on over the next contract or academic year? So hopefully really aligning this conversation with that overarching strategy and action plan would really keep the conversation in the visibility where it needs to be in those types of conversations.
Thank you so much, Natalie. So to everyone listening, if you had any questions in regards to systems reviews and the systems being used to deliver apprenticeships, hopefully we've answered all of them today on this podcast. But if you had any more, we do have the experts here who I'm sure would be happy to answer more. Thank you. So with that, let's finish up. Once again, thank you so much to both Bally, Bhogal of the Alex Group and to Natalie of Natalie Ray Consultancy. Thank you both to our experts here for giving further insights into another aspect of the many aspects of apprenticeships. And thank you to yourselves for listening. Thank you to you both. Cheers.